As I look at using trees in pasture systems in particular, I see very, very significant economic upsides to that because you're able to get so much more value off of that same piece of land, so much more productivity. The trees are able to do things that your forages cannot. They're able to make feed available at times when forages are not able to make that feed available. And overall, the picture looks like you have much, much higher productivity and much higher net income per acre on land that is managed in a good silvopasture system.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, Austin.
Absolutely. It's fun to be back here, planting that we did, and to be able to sit in the shade now. I spent a lot of time planting trees. Rarely do I get to sit in their shade. So this is a treat right here.
Yeah, the pleasures of a tree cultivator, I guess, whatever.
Yeah.
Is there a name for that? Is there a specific name for a
For
tree
what
planter?
I do, a tree
or somebody
planter.
Who cultivates?
Call myself a tree planter. Honestly, more of what I do is just quarterbacking behind the scenes to make sure everything happens.
Yeah.
I don't actually plant many trees myself anymore.
Yeah.
But generally, that's the word that I use.
Nice. Trees for Graziers that's your main gig right now.
Yep.
And then I didn't realize, but you just told me that you have a podcast as well called the Agrarian Futures Podcast.
Yep.
That's cool. You were telling me a little bit about that, and that sounds really fun. It's really interesting. I apologize, I had no idea. But what is the focus of that podcast?
Yeah, so the Agrarian Futures Podcast, we've used it as a way of exploring how did we get to the point that we are right now in agriculture, where we have so few farmers on the land, where farmers don't tend to make much money, if any, in many cases. Everything is so industrialized, where we don't have a significant food culture here in the US like they do in, say, Europe. So how do we get to this point? And really trying to ground this, I'll say, in the attempts of creating a better food system, creating a more just food system, a more life-giving and regenerative food system for all parties, whether that's the land, the livestock, and the humans that are involved, and really trying to ground that in a historical understanding of how we got to be where we are, because with the premise that we can't really make informed decisions about what we need to do going forward without understanding how we got here.
How long have you been working on that podcast?
See, now it's been about 2 years, I think.
Okay, so you've done quite a few episodes.
Yeah.
I was teeing off the next question, which is, what's the answer?
What is the answer?
Have you figured it out?
Yeah, we've figured all of it out, thankfully. You just have to tune into it.
Oh.
I mean, I'm very fortunate to be able to come out of it with, I think, a lot more insight into some of the key parts of agriculture and why it is the way it is. And of course, it's different whether we're talking about produce or we're talking about beef or we're talking about pork or chicken and like those industries, and they've all had their own histories and their own evolutions. But that's been very, very helpful for me. So let's take one example of I did not realize that for the vast majority of the United States history, hundreds of years, pastured, chestnut finished, acorn finished pork was the most abundant and also the cheapest meat available, which currently we think of as very bougie, as really expensive, high-end stuff. But this was the day, say, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, when livestock were allowed to roam free. You had fence-out rules, so you had to keep your crops fenced, and you had to fence out livestock rather than fencing in your livestock so they only go on your property. So livestock were allowed to roam, and when we had abundant forests that were producing acorns and hickories and chestnuts, American chestnuts before those got wiped out by the blight, hogs were allowed to fatten on their own in the woods, and once a year you'd gather them all together, you'd butcher them. Because pork is so fatty, you're able to preserve it well, and it still maintains good flavor.
Yeah.
And so that was the most important meat out there, was pork, because it preserved well without refrigeration. And it was very low labor inputs, very low feed inputs, because they were left to their own devices. And to understand that, which I think very few people recognize. I certainly didn't recognize, and
Yeah.
I've looked at this quite a bit. And just to realize that, and that helped me put into perspective that is actually, that kind of system is possible to recreate. We just need the right conditions for it, and that really relies on perennial tree crop producing trees out on the landscape in abundance in the right configuration. So a well-designed system dropping free feed for pigs throughout the course of the year. And that can be, again, a cost-effective means of raising livestock out on pasture, and actually being price competitive with the way that hogs are currently raised.
Yeah. Well, that's akin to the modern system of rangeland grazing of cattle, where a lot of BLM land or just government contracted land where grazers are able to get these contracts and they pretty much just put their cattle out on tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres, and then they round them up when they reach a certain weight or a certain time of season, and then sell them to the stockyard.
Yep.
Essentially, that system has its own problems, I think, probably with overgrazing, and a lot of those lands are already kind of arid lands, so they can't really withstand a lot of grazing in the first place. But that kind of bridges to what I assume a lot of what you do with Trees for Grazers is trees, perennial plantings in conjunction with other agricultural.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, talk a little bit about Trees for Grazers. How did that, even just to back up, how did you get into that in the first place? Obviously, you're interested and passionate, but why did you start planting trees?
Yeah.
And how did that turn into a business?
So I guess I was kind of forced into running a business, in the sense that, so in college, I studied social work, and with the goal of, I want to do something in my life that helps people. That was kind of all of the premise that I had going into college, not knowing really what I wanted to do. And during college, I learned about sustainable agriculture. I learned about permaculture. I kind of went down that rabbit hole. And said, this is kind of akin to what I want to be able to do, and integrate these two things somehow. Soon after college, I was trying to find my way, trying to figure out how do I do the kind of work that is valuable and meaningful to me. And I knew about agroforestry. I'd taken a course or two then in agroforestry, and I knew I wanted to be involved in that somehow, but there wasn't anyone hiring for an agroforester, or there was no positions available in the area. And at that point, there was very few people doing it. There was the Savannah Institute, but I wasn't about to move all the way to Wisconsin to do that. I wanted to be here locally. By having conversations with folks who were already doing agroforestry, and mostly riparian buffers, so streamside forests here in Pennsylvania, I learned that there was a need for contractors to plant buffers and to take care of those buffers after they were planted. And I said, that's something that I can do without having to have a degree, without having to move. So even though I really didn't have much of an entrepreneurial inkling before that, I started off with an old Jeep that soon broke down, a borrowed trailer, and a walk-behind mower, and that's how I got started in this field. And pretty soon I started doing more plantings, and how I got into silvopasture then was, I had some clients who I was doing stream buffers for, and they were saying, look, this is nice, but I also have a pastured dairy where my livestock are out in pasture throughout the summer, and they experience heat stress. So how could we get trees established in my pasture?
Yeah.
And not just along these streams. And I knew enough that there wasn't anyone doing it, and there wasn't great methods established for establishing those trees in a pasture. So I said, well, let's play around with this. And I figured out that if we could crack this nut, if we could figure out how to get trees established in pastures, the opportunities for that were really, really tremendous. Any farm might have an acre or two or a couple acres of riparian buffer area that oftentimes was hard to integrate with the farm. It didn't really fit in with the rest of what the farm was doing. It was kind of an area that we have to take out of production. And in the meantime, each of those farms might have 30 acres or 50 acres or 200 acres of open pasture, where by adding trees, not only do you provide shade for their livestock, but you're also adding an economic benefit to the farm, as well as the conservation benefits that you get from that. And so I figured out that there was a real need for this if we could systematically figure out ways of establishing trees in pastures. And once we figured that out, we kind of dove into, okay, now what trees does it really make sense to add into pastures? Which trees are going to be a significant net benefit to the farm?
Imagine that is a different answer depending on obviously what region you're in.
Yep.
You primarily just work in Pennsylvania.
So far,
yeah, Eastern Pennsylvania. And there's so many different ways to go with it. I think the riparian buffer zone feels like something to talk about because that is something that historically has been part of conservation planning, part of state or federal funding in order to do perennial plantings to kind of restore riparian buffer zone. For those who don't know what that is, a riparian buffer zone is an area that I think is there a specific measurement of a designation, like 180 feet or something on either side of a perennial stream
or lake or any kind of water body?
Yeah, and the idea is that that is buffering that body of water from any influx of pollutants or contaminants or runoff from farm fields or roadways or things like that. And that is buffering that and keeping those contaminants out of that water body. And so over the years, a lot of farms would expand and you want to push back and expand your fields as far as you can. You want to let the cows graze along the creek. And so we've moved from this being totally wooded area to a lot of fields and then reforestation happening. And there's efforts and funding to replant perennials in those riparian zones. And so that's what you saw as the opportunity to kind of get a foothold in that and then be able to build on that. And that's a good, that's a good perspective, a good place to start. But those species that would go in a riparian buffer zone would be different typically than what you might be planting like out here in a field. How does that? Got some cows across the way.
That's good background audio for this.
What kind of species would you usually be planting and maintaining in a riparian buffer zone?
So it comes down to what do we want to maximize for, right? So in a riparian zone, we want to maximize for conservation value, typically, is what we're doing there. And so oftentimes we're doing fast growing trees that are going to establish that canopy quick. We want to buffer from contaminants. We also want to shade the creek or the water body that we're adjacent to so that we lower the temperatures. Here in Pennsylvania, we're a cold water fisheries state. So trout do the best in cold, clear water. We also want to have a lot of influx of leaves coming from the trees and getting into those water bodies. Yeah, because those then form the basis of the food chain for those water bodies. So the leaves are then broken down by insects that live in the stream, and those are consumed by your fish.
Well, like tree leaves, just grass being on the side doesn't really shed its leaves.
Correct. Yep.
So the leaves are not going into the water. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. And there's even like root exudates that make their way into streams, and those are valuable too, again, as food to start that food chain in the water. And it's a stable food, right? Like if we have pollutants that come in and they bring excess nitrogen, for instance, that can lead to a spike in fertility in the water, but it's a quick hit. And then if you have die off after that, then you're going to have pollution issues. Whereas what trees are providing is a long-term, steady, high-quality food, essentially, for the water system.
Yeah.
And everything that lives in there. And so what we want there is native trees, where the insects that we want are going to have leaves that they want to eat. Because there's a lot of non-native trees that our insects just don't eat. they don't consume. So typically we're doing native trees that tend to be fast growing, mixing in some slower growing long-term trees in there as well. And then for a silvopasture, really what we're doing there is we're trying to maximize for the benefit of the property of the farm operation. And typically the way that we look at it is we are integrating trees that are there to support the livestock operations of that farm is most of what our focus. And so we're providing shade is kind of the big one, especially this time of year. We're recording this on a 90-degree sunny day. And so shade is on everyone's mind. Keeping cool is on everyone's mind. And reducing heat stress for livestock is super, super important. And then reducing cold stress during the winter is another one. Can really help with not having to feed livestock as much because they don't need to burn as many calories in order to stay warm. And then providing feed during times of the year when the feed is otherwise not being produced by your pasture. So again, right now it's spring. We've got plenty of forages. We have an excess of forages, more than most livestock operations can use. And so we hay during this time. But then during the middle of summer, especially during a drought, we might not have enough forages. And we know that during the winter time, we don't have enough forages either. That's a bottleneck for our operations. And so if you can use trees that are going to, whether their leaves are available during the summer months or they drop honey locust pods or persimmon fruits or other mast onto the ground for livestock to consume during the winter time. Those are kind of the main things that we want to see from our silvopasture systems.
So it's kind of a shade shelter from like a windbreak in the winter, essentially, and then supplemental food. That's the one thing that when we were planning this planting, one of the things that was discussed was forage willow. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
And I've never heard of that before, but intentionally planting a perennial stand of willows in a pasture in order for the livestock then to be able to eat that either during the dry summer months or in the winter once the pasture has kind of subsided. I've never heard of that or seen that before. Is that something that is picking up, gaining more interest?
I would say gaining more interest. There's not many people doing it. I would like to see it done. It's something that is practiced quite a bit in New Zealand at this point. And there is variations of it that are used quite a bit in the tropics and subtropics, not with willow, but with other species. The basics there is that even in the worst drought, if you look around, the trees are still green, right? Because they have roots that go down deeper. They can access moisture that grasses cannot access during that time. And so it's a bank, it's a reserve of high quality fodder. And when you look at feed analyses too, the feed quality tends to be higher, in many cases significantly higher for tree fodder than it does for forage. One of the keys there is, and this gets a little bit technical, but lignin. So lignin is what gives grass the structure to be able to stand up. And it's also very hard for cattle to digest. So they don't get much energy out of that. Woody plants, they have all their lignin in the wood. So the wood is providing the structure. The leaves don't have to have that. And so they're much easier for most livestock to digest and get a lot of the feed quality out of that. They also tend to be very high in protein. So you're able to have a really, really high quality feed, a dairy quality or a finishing quality feed on trees. The trick is how to manage it. Right. So that really is the key for figuring out how do we make use of this resource that's fairly significant, whether that's during the summer or you do into the fall, so that you can let your forages stockpile and then you can make use of the forages during the winter then.
Yeah, that is interesting because it's not really planting in the concept of silvopasture. You kind of think about, I'm losing these fields. These fields are not going to be as productive now because I planted a bunch of trees in them. And that may be true for a few seasons, but we could easily have cattle in here right now. The cattle will rub on them. These trees are 3 years old, which is, they're pretty exceptional. The amount of growth that they put on the hybrid Hungarian locust. But you could have cattle in here now. So we maybe sacrificed 2 seasons of foraging or grazing in this area, but now we're ready to have cattle back in here again.
And you don't even have to do that. You don't even have to sacrifice it for that long. When we do our plantings, almost universally, we just set them up so that livestock can be integrated in right away again.
Yeah.
So the minute that we get done with our planting, we can open up the gate and the cows can come right back in, and we protect those trees such that cattle are able to be right in next to the trees, and they don't harm the trees.
Yeah. And like even if they're rubbing on the tree tubes and things like that, or there's electric wire on the tree.
Electric wire.
Yeah. Yeah. So you might not have them access to everything, but they have kind of alleyways.
Well, even so, we've adjusted that. That's how we started. Was, let's say we would have a 6-foot tube, and we would run a poly wire, electric wire at the height that you would normally subdivide a fence or subdivide a pasture with, and that worked. But it also made management more challenging. So now what we do is we tend to use, again, that 6-foot tube, but we put a hole in the top, and we run our electric wire at the top of that now, so that livestock can freely move underneath that. And then what we do is around every tube, we wrap an aluminum wire. So just that tube is electrified. Then they can't rub on the outside of that tube.
And so but that seems like a lot of work, but that will stay there basically for the whole season. It's not like you're moving that.
We don't take it up and down.
Yeah, so that makes a little more sense, practical sense.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. So how does this is very obviously growing trees is not a new thing, but it's kind of progressive in agriculture right now in the US at least. I remember even 6-8 years ago when we were working with the NRCS and we were doing a grant to put up fencing for our livestock, there was conversation about silvopasture, but there was no wording, no mention of silvopasture in any of the grant documents. And it was kind of just like a side conversation.
Yeah.
It was not something that had worked its way into the actual parlance of conservation or grants, state, federal grants, or just like farmland management or possible business opportunities that an agricultural piece of land or an agricultural business could pursue. But now it feels like that's much more commonplace. Seems like you've been right on track.
We've been at the forefront of it.
Yeah.
We are the most silvopasture oriented company in the country. I don't know,
really?
Probably the world too.
Wow. Nice.
Where we don't work in the tropics, and there are other folks that work in the tropics, and they're very focused on silvopasture and how it looks there, which is very different from here. But we have a full-time crew of about 8 to 10 people who are working year round on silvopasture projects. And so we have a very, very high density of plantings that we've been able to enable here in southeastern Pennsylvania and a little bit beyond. We've gone up into New York a little bit, western PA, Maryland. We get a little bit outside of this range, but the closer that a farm is, the more resources we're able to offer, the more hands-on that we can be.
Where's the appetite for that coming from? With landowners? I'm assuming not everybody is necessarily a farmer, but there seems to be a growing appetite of landowners to invest in perennial trees and put them on their land. What's fueling that?
Our work has predominantly been with dairies and folks who are managing pastures. This is mostly the dairies is because of our geography. We're in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and there's a lot of small Amish and Mennonite dairies in our area. But I'd say let's step back and say just more broadly, for those people who are already managing pastures intensively, and they're being very thoughtful about where they move their livestock and how often they move their livestock and how their pastures are doing, they recognize I need to have shade options spread throughout my pasture in order to not have my livestock suffer heat stress during those hottest days of the year, even the hottest months of the year. And if someone's doing continuous grazing and they have their whole 100-acre operation just open to cows, they can wander anywhere where they want, they're always going to find a tree or a wood line or a pond where they can wallow and stay out of the heat. So we're generally not working with those landowners. They're not coming to us and saying, we see the need. It's those people who are already figuring out the grazing side of things, who recognize the need and say, this makes sense on my farm. And also, like, I think it fits within the legacy that people want to leave, the kind of farm aesthetics and the farm just vibrancy that they want to have. They want to have a farm that's full of life, that's full of songbirds, that has nesting habitat, that has more carbon going into the soil and holding the water where it falls. And there's just all kinds of things that I think if you're in farming, as I see a deer over there.
Let's see if he comes over here.
Farming, especially perennial based, grass based, regenerative farming, like, you're not in it because it's going to make you a lot of money, right? If it is, like, that's probably a bad reason, because you're probably not going to be very successful at that. There's other places that you can make a lot more money, but you're in it because you want to steward the land. You want to leave the land a better place. You want to use your time and energy to produce high quality food and a high quality land stewardship. And this just fits within that framework for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think also there is an incentive with increasing land prices, especially in the Lancaster County area. There's enormous amount of pressure for that. Is kind of the prime existence for the Mennonite Amish community, is to have a farm. Even if it's not your full-time thing, you live on a farm and you cultivate the land in some way. And land prices, that's not that far from here, but land prices there are twice what they are here. And you have an incentive to maximize, to kind of stack enterprises on the farm. And can I use this shed for a carpentry shop? Can I, milk the cows? Can I grow some tobacco and dry it in the barn over here? Can I plant some trees out in the field that will provide shade for the animals, but then long term I can harvest them, the locust trees, as fence posts or some kind of timber or something like that. And then the cycle starts again. You plant more trees. So there is a certain incentive as well to have, short, mid, and long-term investments and revenues on the farm, that you're kind of diversifying not only in the short term, but you're diversifying out over time. Because the land access is more is the limiting factor in some regards. It's harder to buy more land.
Absolutely. Yep. And that's a major driver.
Yeah.
It's also in our area, we have a really high density of farms, and the Amish and Mennonite have determined culturally that they are not going to go the way of bigger and bigger, more mechanized, more industrialized farming. Like, they just can't, because of their cultural values that they have decided upon. And so in order to compete, they need to have a different strategy. And so they have really latched on, in many cases, to regenerative systems, sustainable farming, organic, whatever the term you want to use, or whether the label, like organic dairy is a big one among our the clients that work with us. So they have determined this is how we are going to have a differentiated product and stand out in the marketplace, rather than us just trying to compete on a commodity basis, which is not going to work on a 40-acre farm where everything costs $50,000 an acre.
Yeah. And as the other incentives for this is greater availability of state and federal funding too, where you may not have considered this. It may have been kind of on the wish list. If you're a landowner or a farmer, it may have been on the wish list, but maybe you didn't think you would be able to, spend $50,000 on planting trees. But now some of those grant funding. I know that, like, Chesapeake Bay, they've had funding for riparian buffer zone planting for decades. And they've, reached a lot of their goals for restoring that watershed. You're getting into the sun. Should we move over a little bit?
I could use a little bit of vitamin D isn't a bad thing.
Cool. Is that a little better? I don't need to get a sunburn. Chesapeake Bay has been a pretty successful project as far as restoring the watershed through riparian buffer zone and funding a lot of mainly agricultural agricultural properties to plant trees. And there's a lot of flexibility with how they could. There's even stipends that would, I think, for 15 years after planting, maybe some of that funding would provide. You would plant, and you could choose the species you wanted to plant within a certain context, and then some of those would even potentially be like fruit producing species. It's like it's a new agricultural enterprise essentially that would be funded there, and then after 15 years the stipend ends, and then I'm not sure what happens to those plantings long term. Are they allowed to plant black walnut and harvest it eventually, or?
Yeah, so and I think here we're talking about the CREP program in particular, where there is a subsidy available. And there's a whole range of programs, a whole range of conservation nonprofits that are working on this, as well as government agencies. So the CREP program, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, is run through the NRCS, if I'm not mistaken. The deal there is that you can get paid for your land, and in our area, it's often pretty high, maybe $600 per acre per year.
That you're allocating to be planted.
Yeah.
You still own it.
Exactly. You still own it.
But they're saying this area is designated to be a perennial planting, and we're going to pay you by acre for that period of time.
And we're compensating you for the land productivity that's lost because you're putting it into a conservation value. And I think it's measured off of, or the payment is calculated based off of how much in this county would your land be worth to be leased out, and we're going to pay you, I think it's 150% of that. So it can be a really good deal for farmers, especially in areas where it's along a stream. Oftentimes it's not really great quality. It's too wet. It's too soggy. There's ditches and all kinds of stuff. It's not easy to navigate. So you're not getting a lot out of it anyway in many cases. So then they'll pay you for the land and pay to have the trees planted on the front end. And you can sign up for either a 10 or a 15-year contract, and then you can renew.
Okay.
You can renew as often as you want. And I don't think you'd be allowed to harvest black walnuts while under contract. But if at some point, 45 years down the road, it comes time for those walnuts to be harvested, or they're mature and you want to pull it out of contract, that would be your decision. So and you retain ownership of it, and you just have to abide by the rules of the contract so long as it's under contract.
Yeah.
You can't eventually opt to not renew it.
Yeah. So that's an example of a really successful program where there's some federal funding, or is that federal or state?
It's federal funding.
Federal funding to incentivize tree planting, which also then empowers small businesses, farms, to have some additional income or alternative crops, or provide other structural benefits like we discussed earlier, like shade for livestock or things like that. There's obviously a bunch of other programs.
Ton, absolutely. And the success there hasn't been nearly as many acres of stream buffers planted as Pennsylvania has aimed for. So even though there are quite a few stream buffers that we see going up, it's a fraction of how many should be for the water quality in order to get anywhere close to where we want to be for the quality of our waters, the quality of the animals, the fish that live in there.
Yeah.
I was just yesterday for me, I had another reminder of our shifting baseline and how much it has shifted. So I was looking up what all we've lost since dams were introduced.
Yeah.
And we used to have like streams, even fairly small streams, used to be full during certain times of the year of shad, of eels, of migratory fish that would come from the ocean, and they would come up to spawn, or in the case of eels, they would live up here, and then they would go to the ocean to spawn, but then they would be here as adults. And freshwater mussels were here in abundance, and those would be filtering the water. And there's dozens of other species that were dependent, that were existing in these creeks.
Yeah.
And not even to mention trout and all of those that we've lost, and now most of our creeks just have minnows and chubs and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And we don't have nearly the diversity that we once did, but most of us never lived through that period. So we don't remember, we don't have that cultural memory. Going back to the stream buffers, there's a lot of room for us to go. And part of what I want to see in the silvopasture is to offer a agroforestry practice, a means of using trees on the landscape that is not only economically viable, or maybe I should say, not only is bringing conservation benefits, but is also economically viable and economically more productive,
Yeah.
because you have this one-time investment in trees that are then producing for you year after year after year, and particularly in the form of trees that are providing feed or providing shade for livestock. They're producing for you at lower costs than even what a conventional, whether it's corn or soybeans or whatever, you're able to produce feed at lower cost than by using grain.
Yeah, that is fascinating. It's a grand vision to see the stream ecosystems restored as well. I hope that our planting down here is a forest sometime in my
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
lifetime. Trees that you guys planted are doing well. So what haven't we talked about that we should? What have I not asked you that you feel like is important to add? I think you're getting at something really valuable, which is that this is not just a luxury thing.
Mm.
Planting trees on land, it can be something that is an economic benefit
Yes. Yeah.
to a business.
Yeah. And I know that you have background in real estate now and have interest in helping farmers get access to the land, and that being a critical bottleneck. And as I look at agroforestry, as I look at using trees in pasture systems in particular, I see very, very significant economic upsides to that, because you're able to get so much more value off of that same piece of land, so much more productivity. And you're able to have that productivity. If the trees are able to do things that your forages cannot, they're able to make feed available at times when forages are not able to make that feed available. I mean, overall, the picture looks like you have much, much higher productivity and much higher net income per acre on land that is managed in a good silvopasture system,
Yeah.
a well-managed silvopasture system with the right trees, the right genetics.
And the thing that strikes me though about that is it's interesting because not everyone is a farmer and wants to have shade for their cattle, but some people own land or want to invest in land. And the thing about the trees is, like, grass is kind of grass. You either graze it or you make hay out of it, or you just mow it. But trees, you could replace any one of these trees here with a different species and have a different timeline, a different economic model, a different benefit or value. And you're taking up the exact same amount of space, but you have a totally different, almost like micro business model. So, like, these are black locust trees, and the purpose of them is to produce timber, to produce fence posts that are rot resistant and don't need to be pressure treated, or to produce maybe decking for someone's deck boards. And so there's not a lot of other benefit to them in the short term other than, like you mentioned, shade. But you could replace these with something else that was a nut producing tree, and then you could have an actual food source that you could market and sell. So that's what I feel like is the unique part about trees, is that you can swap. It's the same structure, the same footprint is adaptable to different micro business models or different landowner needs and wants and desires. So it's that's kind of fascinating.
It really is a whole world of opportunities that opens up for, and speaking particularly to pasture operations, once you figure out how to integrate trees into a pasture, especially without completely changing the management of it, then the sky's the limit, really, of what trees make the most sense on my farm, in my operation, which ones will help me just maximize what I'm doing here. And we haven't even started to scratch the surface of it. There's work to be done on the genetics of trees. So you have the right types of, whether it's pods or fruits, dropping for livestock, propagation methods, so that we can take something that up until recently has been fairly niche and expensive. So if a couple years ago I wanted to get a grafted honey locust, I'd probably have to pay $50 for something that's this big. Whereas now we're growing thousands of them per year, and we can pay half as much for a tree that's 2 or 3 times the size, and it's going to get to maturity much faster.
Yeah, there's a whole other genetic and the technological development of tree genetics.
Yeah.
We don't have that I don't feel like that's something that we're as progressive on in the US. But if you go to other countries like Australia or New Zealand, maybe down south here in the US, the pine, the really rapidly growing species of pine trees that are planted specifically for, we kind of just draw on the existing native resources that we have here, which we have a very wooded, temperate climate. I think Pennsylvania is one of the highest timber production states in the country. 99.9% of that has not been planted by any human being, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, and we have done quite a bit of work here in the United States, whether it's on apples or peaches or blackberries, or there's all kinds of perennial crops that we have invested time into. And we've invested time into a couple of these more agroforestry, pasture-related crops, but it's been almost no research, almost no development, and most of it happened 100 years ago. So as I look at this, I see one of the main challenges of agroforestry, so the investment of trees onto a landscape, is the time horizons, right?
Yeah.
Because it's an upfront investment that takes years to get to the point where it's yielding you returns. It might only be 3 years in some cases for some of these more fast maturing crops, but it's still quite a few years until they're giving you anything. For that, we need financial models that make sense.
Yeah.
Because that really is what finance is for, right? Like when you buy a house, it's a lot of money up front. And most of us don't pay cash for a house. We get a loan so we can stretch the cost of that house out over the course of a 30-year mortgage. And with trees, if we can do the same thing, if we pencil out this tree is going to yield me $20 per year, and if I can get a loan that it only costs me $2 per year to service that loan, then this is a great investment.
Yeah,
but I need to have that financial tool and also the confidence that what I'm writing out on paper is actually going to come true.
You're still cultivating a living organism. There's still the higher risk potential that agriculture always lends to a business. So, you can get a loan, plant the trees, and if they all die, then you got to plant more trees, I guess. So there has to be a plan for maintenance and actually executing on the recouping of that value or that potential investment return.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's cool. Yeah, that's a fascinating. Is that not happening? Are there banks that will lend on perennial tree planting crops or tree planting projects?
Not yet that I know of. I think if someone was interested in it, they could probably talk to some of the more forward-thinking organizations out there and probably get some kind of a loan. But this is a place where I think there's a real opportunity for family offices in particular, and other organizations who are conservation oriented or who are sustainability oriented and want their money to go towards creating a better world. I would love to be able to set up a fund at some point with a family office and say, look, let's give loans that are low interest. And maybe they track inflation. But essentially for the farmer, then it doesn't cost you anything. If all the loan does is it tracks inflation, you're essentially not having to pay anything extra. And you're just spreading that cost out over a longer period of time. And the money all goes back into the family office and then gets lent out again. Something very simple like that, where you're able to put your money to work, allow farmers the financial flexibility to create these perennial ecosystems, because it's hard to cash flow these otherwise without some kind of, whether it's a grant or a loan. And I think grants will only go so far. Grants are fantastic right now for proof of concept, for gaining momentum. They've been absolutely critical for us. But as I look at this, I'm in the position where I would gladly take a loan to go out and plant 100 acres of tree crops, because I'm confident in the numbers and in our ability to keep these trees alive and have them come to maturity quickly and yield the kind of crops that we need them to yield. So I'm already in that place. I think most people are not going to be there quite yet, but I think in the next 5 and 10 years, we'll see a lot more people gaining the confidence that, yes, this is going to work and I want this on my farm, and I don't want to wait for the red tape, wait to navigate all the red tape that is required by grants in many cases.
Yeah, I love those kind of business models or ideas where this is not a new idea at all.
Yeah.
It's literally ancient idea, but when you just tweak it a little bit, all of a sudden it becomes so innovative, and that's yeah, I love that kind of stuff. I feel like we should do another episode and just talk about that whole piece of it.
Yeah, like you were saying, it's an ancient thing that you can apply modern finance to. You can apply modern breeding to. Right now, we're working with several companies to try to get honey locust into tissue culture. So that's micro propagation in a lab under sterile conditions, so that you can take one quality standout tree and turn it into 1 million in a little over a year, if that's what you want.
Yeah, because you're trying to zero in on these like slight little minor genetic mutations or whatever that only happen once in a blue moon. And if you can identify those, then you can replicate it, and you have something that's, has a whole different economic, proposition with that genetic.
And it gives just a significantly higher level of consistency, of confidence that I know the genetics of this tree it's going to be a high quality tree. It's not going to have significant downsides like thorns on it. It's going to yield a high amount productively or consistently over the course of years. And then we can propagate that. We can give that consistency and that confidence. Yeah, that's where we're moving. There's a lot of things, like we've come a long way in the last 5 or 6 years that we've been working on this, but there's so much more yet to do. But it's fun that we're picking up momentum, and I can see those milestones getting closer and closer over time.
Yeah. And where can people find more information out about Trees for Graziers? .com?
Treesforgraziers.com. Very simple. We have a ton of resources there.
Nice.
Yep. Our goal really is to show people what we've figured out in our work here in this area, so that they can replicate it, whether that's on their own farm, as a service provider in their own area. We really want this to spread. We can only do so much outside of our own area. We really want this to take off in other parts of the country. So we have a ton of educational materials on our website to grow and sell silvopasture specific trees as well. And those are available seasonally through our website. And then we're always happy to sit down with folks and consult with them. Because we do this day in and day out, this is literally what we do all the time. We can help people avoid costly mistakes if they're doing a planting for the first time on their own farm.
Yeah, because you've seen it done so many different times in so many different circumstances. Literally every one is different. It's not like you're building a warehouse and you're lining up all the conveyor lines or something. Every single planting of trees is completely unique, and each farm business, as we talked about, and each, piece of land is unique. So there's pitfalls and benefits and advantages that you can leverage.
And yet there are certain consistent things that we need to be wary of on each planting, whether it's moisture stress, predation by rodents, damage by livestock. And those are the things that we can help you figure out and how those apply to your own context.
Cool. Well, I think we got enough here.
Very good. Thanks. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, that was fun.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I want to keep talking about all that stuff. It's fascinating.